Hello, Ross's Rock Stars. Today we're going to discuss one of our elements of narrative writing, conflict. There are 6 main types of conflict, the first of which is individual versus self. This is a problem that you might deal with in your own mind, a problem with deciding what to do or think. So, for example, you might have a quandary when you're deciding whether or not to study for Miss Ross's English class or go outside and play with your friends. Spoiler alert, you should always study for English class, then go play with your friends. You also might have a conflict if you're deciding whether to make up or break up with that special sweetheart that you have. As long as it's your decision, if your special sweetheart was to dump you on your rear end, you would be dealing with a different type of conflict that we'll discuss on the next slide. But for right now, I want you to pause this video and write on your notes underneath these examples your own example of a conflict that you would think is individual versus self. Moving right along. You also have individual versus individual conflicts, and this is when a character in the writing has a problem with another character. So the example here is Batman versus Penguin, or really Batman versus any of the villains that he fights in the comics or in the movies. Go ahead here, pause this video, take a moment to write underneath this example one that you can come up with on your own. A third type of conflict is individual versus nature. This is when the character has a problem with a force of nature. So, some examples of movies that you may have seen: Twister and Jurassic Park. Twister, of course, the characters face an evil tornado. Jurassic Park, the characters face evil dinosaurs. Even though those dinosaurs were genetically engineered, they're still now a force of nature. You also might have an earthquake. It's an unstoppable force of nature. Go ahead and pause this video, take a moment to write down your own example of individual versus nature. Another type of conflict, individual versus society. This is a person's problem with the law or the beliefs of a group. So, a few examples here: Law and Order. You might find that the villains or the criminals in Law and Order have a conflict versus society. Also, Anne Frank. Now, this is one where Anne Frank is obviously your main character and would be your protagonist. The society that she's dealing with is Nazi Germany, and so society is actually kind of the negative force in Anne Frank. Go ahead and pause this video. I'd like you to take a moment to write down one example that you can think of individual versus society. A fifth type of conflict is individual versus technology, or man versus machine. This is where the character has a problem with a machine, as you might imagine. So some examples here are Terminator or 2001: A Space Odyssey. Take a moment to think about some type of conflict, whether it's a movie you've seen or one that you can think of individual versus technology. And a final type of conflict that we'll look at is individual versus supernatural. Halloween's coming up. This is where your character has a problem with a monster, a ghost, or some other extraterrestrial force. Some examples include Ghostbusters, Mummies, Buffy the Vampire Slayer. I can think of several novels offhand that you might have read that would be great examples. So take a moment here, pause your video, and write an example that you can think of. Now let's talk about the 2 types of conflict. You got 6 types of conflict and they're lumped into 2 groups. One is an internal conflict. The definition of an internal conflict is a struggle that takes place in a person's mind. This is where you have a character that's dealing with his or her own mixed emotions. This character might be faced with a choice between right and wrong, or maybe there are two different solutions to a problem, even two different paths that this character could choose to take. This is an internal conflict. Now, we've already looked at the 6 types of conflict. The one that is internal is individual versus self. This is the only internal conflict. So again, your examples, do I study for English or hang out with my friends? Remember, we already learned the answer to this question. Or should I stay at this party or should I go? Internal conflict, individual versus self, is your only internal conflict. Now you also have external conflicts, and this is the struggle between a character and an outside force. Your character might be struggling against another character, or the character might be struggling against forces of nature. So, for example, you might have a story about the main character struggling against the Arctic cold. Remember the 6 conflicts that we learned before? Think about which one that might be. To review, you have individual versus individual, which includes conflicts between men and women, heroes and villains, parents and children, siblings, teachers and students, anytime 2 humans or more come into a disagreement with each other. You also have individual versus nature, which is another external conflict. Man can be an aggressor towards nature when he hunts or pollutes or destroys the rainforest. And nature can be an aggressor towards man when man is trying to survive a snowstorm, earthquakes, tornadoes, tsunamis. Nature is also the aggressor when animals attack. So think about Jaws. That would be a great example of an external conflict, specifically individual versus nature. Individual versus society is also an external conflict. Anytime society opposes the individual or discriminates against a person for race, gender, religion, age, or style of dress, this is man against society or society against man. The criminal versus the police is another example of this external conflict. Individual versus machine or technology. If you've ever had an ATM eat up your bank card or had your computer freeze up on you or maybe your printer jam, you might know about this conflict. Sometimes this conflict can be a person versus a robot or a computer that has gone bad. Like we said before, Terminator would be a great example of this external conflict. Another external conflict is the individual versus the supernatural. This is a conflict that isn't discussed a whole lot, but it's the essence of your ghost stories, mythology, werewolves, vampires. Anytime the person asks the question, is this fate? That's also the individual versus supernatural, when you have this powerful outside force working against your character. I hope you enjoyed our discussion of conflict. Thanks a lot for listening.